In early 1962, the helicopters sent to Vietnam by President Kennedy flew their first combat missions against the NLF. In Operation Chopper, the aircraft flown by U.S. Army pilots ferried 1,000 South Vietnamese soldiers to sweep an NLF stronghold near Saigon. It was the beginning of a whole new phase of the conflict. From the start, the American helicopters had a dramatic effect on the fighting. Government troops could take the guerrillas by surprise or cut off their line of retreat after a battle. Often they panicked and were killed as they tried to escape. In the first months of 1962, the South Vietnamese Army won a string of victories, badly shaking the NLF's morale. Using helicopters for offensive operations called for a whole new set of tactics. It was a complex business in which helicopter forces and ground units had to be strictly coordinated. But the aim was simple. The enemy had to be found, fixed in position, and then defeated. Government troops called it spear and net. Later, it would become known as search and destroy. A search and destroy operation usually began with intelligence locating an NLF unit. The task then was to place forces to cut off the enemy's retreat. If there was a river nearby, South Vietnamese gunboats were deployed in blocking positions. Infantry on foot and in armored personnel carriers were moved in overland. Meanwhile, American helicopters loaded up with government troops rendezvoused with their escort of ground attack aircraft. After bombing or artillery strikes, the airborne infantry landed and advanced towards the enemy, acting as the offensive spear. Trapped by the net of blocking forces, the Viet Cong would be forced to do battle and be destroyed by vastly superior firepower, or so the theory went. The instant success of helicopter operations seemed to prove that the approach favored by the Americans was the right one. What U.S. advisors wanted now was more and bigger offensive operations. The greatest need was for more helicopters, and the Americans quickly provided them. A series of government victories followed, and soon it looked as if the South Vietnamese Army might, in the not-too-distant future, actually defeat the guerrillas. In July 1962, General Paul D. Harkins, head of the U.S. Military Assistance Command in Saigon, reported to Washington that tremendous progress was being made in South Vietnam. It was just what President Kennedy wanted to hear, and in the White House there was a deep sense of relief. They hoped they could bring home all U.S. military personnel by the end of 1965. To Ho Chi Minh and the leaders of North Vietnam, the big increase in American military support for the South was deeply troubling. Did the U.S. mean to put in combat troops? Or perhaps even invade the North itself? They appealed to the Chinese leader Mao Zedong for help. Mao was anxious to be seen as the champion of liberation movements around the world. He was also determined to counter the American strategy in Vietnam. In the summer of 1962, the Chinese leader promised Ho Chi Minh substantial support for the guerrilla war against the Southern government. Right away, North Vietnam would get 90,000 extra rifles for the Viet Cong. As yet, the Americans knew nothing of the Chinese decision to back the war. They were still highly optimistic. Although the NLF were not being beaten on the battlefield and had managed to hit over 2,500 hamlets in 1962 alone, pacification programs designed to increase government control over the countryside promised real progress in the villages. In a program coordinated by the Central Intelligence Agency, U.S. Special Forces were working with Montagnard tribal groups in the central highlands of South Vietnam. They fortified villages and trained local volunteers to fight the Viet Cong in their own areas. The tactics involved setting ambushes, heavy night patrolling, and above all, responding fast to guerrilla incidents. The civilian irregular defense forces created by the American teams were highly effective. The NLF found it increasingly difficult to organize openly amongst the population. At its peak, the program would encompass thousands of villages and hundreds of thousands of people. While the effort in the highlands was entirely an American initiative, further south the Saigon government had embarked on its own pacification program. Backed by the CIA, called the Strategic Hamlets Program, the idea was to create 11,000 settlements which could defend themselves from the Viet Cong and bring government authority into the countryside. The campaign